October 2nd, 1941. The sun has not yet risen over the desolate fields near Rosslevel, but the air is already vibrating with a terrifying, mechanical low-frequency hum. Inside the cold steel hull of his Panzer IV, Oberleutnant Hans Becker adjusts his throat microphone and wipes a smudge of grease from the periscope glass. His breath fogging slightly in the morning chill, he watches as a green signal flare arcs silently into the pale dawn sky, shattering the waiting silence. Suddenly, the earth beneath his tracks begins to tremble violently as thousands of engines roar to life simultaneously. Becker shouts the order to advance, and his tank lurches forward, joining an endless river of armor stretching as far as the eye can see. This is not merely an attack, it is a tidal wave of steel designed to drown the Soviet Union once and for all. This massive offensive was christened Operation Typhoon by the German High Command, a name intended to signify a force of nature that no human construction could withstand. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock had assembled a staggering concentration of power within Army Group Center, numbering nearly 2 million men, over 1,000 tanks, and 14,000 artillery pieces. The objective was singular and absolute, which was the capture of Moscow before the onset of winter. The German leadership believed the Red Army was on its last legs, having suffered millions of casualties since the invasion began in June. Adolf Hitler had declared to his troops that this would be the final battle of the year, the decisive blow that would smash the center of Bolshevik resistance and bring the war in the East to a victorious conclusion within weeks. The strategy relied on the proven doctrine of the double pincer movement, a tactic that had already delivered stunning victories at Minsk and Kiev earlier that summer. 3 panzer groups were deployed to slice through the Soviet lines like a surgeon's scalpel. General Heinz Guderian and his 2nd Panzer Group drove from the south towards Orel, while General Hermann Hoth and General Erich Hoepner commanded their tank armies to strike north and central. Their goal was to encircle the Soviet defensive armies commanded by Generals Konev and Budyonny, trapping them in massive pockets west of the capital. The sheer density of German armor concentrated on narrow breakthrough sectors created a localized superiority that the stretched and demoralized Soviet defenders could not hope to match. On the other side of the line, the Soviet leadership was tragically unprepared for the direction and intensity of the strike. Joseph Stalin and the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had convinced themselves that the Germans would likely pause to consolidate their gains or strike south towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. Consequently, the defenses along the direct approaches to Moscow were dangerously thin, manned by exhausted divisions that had not been properly reinforced. When the German artillery barrage began, tearing up communication lines and command bunkers, the Soviet generals at the front found themselves blind and deaf. Reports of massive tank columns breaking through were initially dismissed by Moscow as panic or exaggeration, a fatal delay that cost the Red Army precious hours to react. The speed of the German advance was nothing short of breathtaking, stunning both the defenders and the attackers with its rapidity. Guderian's tanks tore up the ground, advancing upwards of 40 miles a day, bypassing strongpoints and leaving the chaotic cleanup to the infantry following in their wake. By October 3rd, the German spearheads had captured the key city of Orel. The surprise was so total that when the German tanks rolled down the main boulevard, the city's electric trams were still operating, ferrying commuters who had no idea the enemy was within 100 miles. Evacuation trains filled with industrial machinery were captured before they could even leave the station, fueling the German belief that the Soviet collapse was imminent and irreversible. North of Orel, the situation was rapidly developing into a catastrophe of historic proportions for the Soviet Union. The German pincers were closing around 2 massive concentrations of Soviet troops near the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk. It was a textbook encirclement, executed with ruthless precision by the Wehrmacht. At Vyazma, the jaws of the trap snapped shut on October 7th, enclosing 4 Soviet armies totaling hundreds of thousands of men. Inside the pocket, command and control disintegrated completely. General Mikhail Lukin, commanding the trapped 19th Army, tried desperately to organize a breakout, but without air support or ammunition, his forces were being squeezed into an ever-shrinking kill zone. The skies above the battlefield belonged entirely to the Luftwaffe, adding a dimension of terror that paralyzed Soviet movements during daylight hours. Dive bombers, specifically the screeching Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, roamed freely over the trapped pockets, hunting for columns of trucks and horse-drawn artillery. The roads inside the Vyazma and Bryansk pockets became graveyards of twisted metal and burning vehicles. Soviet soldiers, lacking anti-aircraft guns, could only dig into the earth and wait for the bombardment to pass. The psychological impact was devastating. Many young conscripts, some of whom had only held a rifle for a few weeks, found their morale shattered by the relentless aerial pounding and the realization that they were cut off from their capital. Inside the tightening rings of the encirclement, the scenes were apocalyptic. The trapped Soviet soldiers were running out of food, fuel, and ammunition, yet orders from Stalin demanded they stand and fight to the last drop of blood. Desperate breakout attempts were launched at night, with waves of Red Army infantry charging German machine gun positions, often arm in arm, singing patriotic songs in a macabre display of fatalism. The German gunners, exhausted from the slaughter, mowed them down in rows. Field Marshal von Bock wrote in his diary about the ferocity of the trapped Russians, noting that while their tactical situation was hopeless, their resistance was delaying the infantry needed for the final push on Moscow. Despite the fierce resistance of the trapped units, the tactical victory for Germany was staggering in its scale. By mid-October, the pockets had been largely liquidated. The Germans claimed to have taken over 600,000 prisoners in the Vyazma and Bryansk operations alone, a number so large it was difficult to comprehend. Long, grey columns of Soviet prisoners of war, stripping the countryside of any edible vegetation like a swarm of locusts, shuffled slowly westward towards starvation and captivity. To the German High Command, these numbers confirmed that the Red Army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The road to Moscow, now less than 100 miles away, seemed wide open, with no significant organized defense standing between the panzers and the Kremlin. In Berlin, the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive, declaring the war effectively won. Otto Dietrich, the Reich press chief, announced to foreign correspondents that the military resistance of the Soviet Union had been destroyed and would never rise again. Newspapers across Germany printed headlines celebrating the impending fall of Moscow. The mood in the German headquarters was one of jubilant arrogance. Maps were already being drawn up for the victory parade in Red Square, and specialist demolition teams were being designated to blow up the Kremlin. The soldiers at the front, buoyed by their lightning victories, began to believe they would be home by Christmas, warm and victorious. However, amidst the celebrations and the headlong rush eastward, ominous signs were beginning to appear for those who looked closely. The German supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, struggling to ferry fuel and ammunition over hundreds of miles of primitive Russian roads. The panzers, having driven non-stop for weeks, were suffering from mechanical breakdowns at an alarming rate. Engines were seizing, tracks were snapping, and the maintenance crews could not keep up with the wear and tear. Furthermore, the German troops were still clad in their light summer uniforms. The logistical planners, confident of a quick victory, had deprioritized the shipment of winter clothing, a calculation that was about to have horrific consequences. Back in Moscow, the full scale of the disaster was finally dawning on the Soviet leadership. The destruction of the armies at Vyazma and Bryansk had left a gaping hole in the front line. There were virtually no reserves left between the Germans and the capital. On October 10th, Stalin made a critical decision, recalling General Georgy Zhukov from Leningrad. Zhukov, the Red Army's most capable commander, flew into Moscow to find a city on the edge of hysteria. Upon reviewing the situation, Zhukov reported to Stalin that the Mozhaisk defense line, a ring of fortifications under construction west of the city, was the only thing standing in the way of the enemy, and it was woefully undermanned. The Mozhaisk line became the focal point of desperate improvisation. With the regular army decimated in the pockets, the defense of the capital fell to a motley collection of survivors, cadets from military academies, and hastily assembled militia divisions. Young students from the Podolsk artillery and infantry schools were rushed to the front, armed with training weapons and orders to hold the line at all costs. These teenagers, the future officers of the Red Army, were thrown into the path of battle-hardened SS divisions, They dug into the muddy banks of rivers and the edges of forests, knowing that there was no one behind them to take their place if they failed. As the German columns regrouped for the final thrust, the weather began to shift, signaling the end of the dry autumn. The clear blue skies that had facilitated the Luftwaffe's dominance turned a sullen, leaden, grey. The temperature dropped, and the first mix of rain and wet snow began to fall on the vast, open plains of Russia. The dirt roads, which were the arteries of the German advance, began to soften. The dust that had choked the panzer crews for weeks was replaced by a slick, sticky substance that clung to boots and wheels alike. It was the first breath of the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, and it would prove to be a more formidable opponent than any army the Germans had yet faced. The first phase of the Battle of Moscow had ended in a tactical masterstroke for Germany, destroying huge swathes of the Soviet military. Yet, the strategic objective remained tantalizingly out of reach. The Wehrmacht stood at the gates, their binoculars trained on the horizon where the spires of Moscow lay, but they were exhausted, overextended, and unprepared for what was coming. The momentum of the unstoppable wave was about to collide with the friction of geography and the sheer will of a nation with its back to the wall. As the rain intensified, turning the Russian earth into a quagmire, the Blitzkrieg was about to face its first true test of endurance. The rain began not as a storm, but as a relentless, suffocating drizzle that erased the horizon and turned the world into a grey smear. By the second week of October, the skies over the central front had opened up entirely, unleashing a torrent that would not cease for weeks. The primitive Russian dirt roads, which had been the arteries of the German advance, dissolved almost instantly. The fine dust that had coated the lungs of the infantry during the summer was replaced by a thick, glutinous substance that defied description. This was the Rasputitsa, the biannual season of mud that had defeated invaders for centuries, and it arrived with the force of a biblical plague to drown the German war machine. For the drivers of the German supply columns, the change in terrain was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation for mechanization, relied heavily on commercial two-wheel drive trucks commandeered from all over Europe to transport fuel and ammunition. These vehicles were hopelessly ill-equipped for the Russian autumn. They slid off the cambered roads into ditches, their wheels spinning uselessly in sludge that reached up to the axles. Convoys that had previously covered 50 miles a day now struggled to move 5. Drivers wept in frustration as they burned out their clutches trying to rock their vehicles free, eventually abandoning them to the sucking earth as the traffic jams stretched back for dozens of miles. The situation was even more desperate for the motorized infantry and the panzer divisions. The tanks, heavy beasts of war designed for hard ground, found themselves floundering like beached whales. The narrow tracks of the Panzer III and IV tanks, perfect for the paved roads of France, cut too deeply into the soft Russian soil. They sank under their own weight, their bellies resting on the mud, rendering their tracks useless. Crews spent more time digging their machines out with spades and wooden beams than they did fighting the enemy. The terrifying momentum of the Blitzkrieg, which relied entirely on speed and maneuver, ground to a shuddering, agonizing halt. To keep the advance moving, the German engineers were forced to build corduroy roads across the vast quagmires. This back-breaking labor required laying thousands of felled trees side by side, transversely across the route, to create a floating platform for the vehicles. The infantry, already exhausted from months of combat, were turned into lumberjacks and road builders. They stood knee-deep in freezing slime, heaving wet logs into place while icy rain soaked through their summer uniforms. Every mile of advance was purchased with sweat and misery, and the road surface was so uneven that it shook the trucks to pieces, snapping axles and shattering suspensions as they bounced over the timber. The mud did not just stop machines, it killed the horses that were the true backbone of the German logistical system. The Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union with over 600,000 horses, used to pull artillery pieces and supply wagons. In the Rasputitsa, these animals suffered terribly. They struggled to pull heavy loads through the suction of the mud, their hearts bursting from the exertion. Fodder could not be brought up from the rear, so the horses starved or ate the thatch from the roofs of peasant huts. Their carcasses soon lined the roads, sinking slowly into the mire, serving as grim mile markers for the advancing troops. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of armored warfare, watched his 2nd Panzer Group disintegrate not from enemy fire, but from logistics failure. He was effectively stuck near Mtsensk, unable to exploit the breakthroughs he had achieved days earlier. His fuel tankers were stranded 50 miles to the rear, and his tanks were running on fumes. He wrote frantic letters to Army Group Center, demanding air supply. But the Luftwaffe was grounded by the same low cloud ceiling that was soaking the ground. Guderian realized with horror that the weather had neutralized his superior tactics. He could no longer flank the enemy. He was forced to attack head-on, along the few paved roads that existed, right into the teeth of waiting Soviet guns. While the Germans struggled, the mud offered a brief, miraculous reprieve for the Red Army. The retreating Soviet units were falling back towards their supply hubs, moving closer to the railheads radiating from Moscow. They used the rail network, which was unaffected by the mud, to shuffle reinforcements to the critical sectors. The T-34 tank also proved its superiority in these conditions. With its wide tracks and lower ground pressure, the T-34 could glide over the mud that swallowed the German panzers. Soviet tankers began to launch stinging ambushes, utilizing their mobility to strike at the paralyzed German columns before vanishing back into the mist and rain. One such encounter occurred near the village of Mtsensk, where Colonel Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade ambushed Guderian's vanguard. The Soviet T-34 seconds emerged from the woods, their sloped armor deflecting the German shells, and decimated a column of German armor that was stuck on a narrow road. It was a shock to the German commanders, who were used to their tanks reigning supreme. For the first time, Guderian admitted in his reports that the German tanks were technically inferior to the Soviet models in these conditions. The psychological impact of seeing their shells bounce off the T-34 seconds, while their own tanks sat immobilized in the mud, shook the confidence of the panzer crews. Closer to Moscow, along the Volokolamsk highway, General Konstantin Rokossovsky was using the time bought by the mud to knit together a defense from nothing. His 16th Army was a patchwork of decimated units, but the impassable terrain channeled the Germans into predictable kill zones. Rokossovsky, a survivor of Stalin's purges who had been pulled from a gulag to command, understood that he did not need to defeat the Germans, only to delay them until winter arrived. He ordered his men to mine the few passable roads heavily. Every bridge was blown, every culvert booby-trapped. The mud was his greatest ally, and he exploited it ruthlessly. However, the pause in the German advance did not mean safety for the Soviet soldiers. Conditions in the foxholes were appalling. The trenches filled with water as fast as they could be dug. Soldiers slept standing up or crouching on ammunition crates to keep out of the freezing slush. Dysentery and trench foot ran rampant through the ranks. Without waterproof boots or proper shelter, the skin on the soldiers' feet turned white and necrotic. Yet, the Soviet political commissars drilled into them a singular message behind them: lay Moscow. There was nowhere left to retreat. They had to hold the line in the mud, or the war was lost. To the rear of the front lines, the Soviet population was mobilized in a titanic effort to fortify the capital. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites, primarily women and elderly men, were marched out into the rain to dig anti-tank ditches. They worked without heavy machinery, using shovels and pickaxes to carve jagged scars into the soaking wet earth. These civilians worked 12-hour shifts in the freezing rain, their clothes never drying out. They built miles of dragon's teeth, concrete pillboxes, and tank traps. It was a display of total war, where the distinction between soldier and civilian vanished in the shared misery of the mud. For the German High Command, the stalling of the offensive created a crisis of time. They knew that the Russian winter was approaching, but they had no accurate concept of its severity. Field Marshal von Bock urged his commanders to push on, believing that one last exertion would shatter the Soviet resistance before the deep snows arrived. He ignored the reports of exhaustion and mechanical failure, driven by the map that showed Moscow tantalizingly close. This pressure from the top forced local commanders to commit their infantry to senseless attacks through waist-deep mud, wasting lives to gain a few hundred yards of useless swamp. The logistical collapse meant that the German soldiers at the front were beginning to starve. The rations that reached the forward units were meager and sporadic. A loaf of bread had to be shared among 10 men. The field kitchens were miles behind. Stuck in the traffic jams, soldiers resorted to eating local produce they could loot from the peasants, potatoes and cabbages dug from the wet fields. The disciplined, well-fed army that had crossed the border in June was transforming into a ragged, scavenging horde. Their uniforms were tattered and caked in filth, and their faces were gaunt with hunger and fatigue. As October drew to a close, the temperature began to fluctuate wildly. At night, the mercury dipped below freezing, turning the mud into hard, jagged ruts that could slash tires and break ankles. By mid-morning, the sun would thaw the ground back into a soup. This freeze-thaw cycle was torture for the equipment and the men. It teased the German commanders with the promise of solid ground, only to snatch it away. The German generals began to pray for the frost. They believed that once the ground froze solid, their tanks could roll again, and they could finish the job. They wished for the cold, not realizing they were wishing for their own doom. The Battle of Moscow had devolved into a slow-motion wrestling match in a pit of clay. The lightning war was dead, drowned in the Rasputitsa. The Germans were still advancing, but at a glacial pace that allowed the Soviets to reinforce their shattered lines. The contest was no longer about tactical brilliance or superior maneuvering. It was about endurance. As the rain finally turned to snow in the last days of October, the stage was set for a new kind of horror. The mud was about to harden, but so was the resolve of the defenders, and the temperature was dropping fast. By the middle of October 1941, the distant rumble of artillery had become a permanent background noise for the residents of Moscow, a constant reminder of the encroaching catastrophe. The city, which had stood as the heart of the Russian Empire for centuries, was now teetering on the brink of total collapse. The air was thick not just with the smoke of burning documents, but with a palpable, electric tension that frayed the nerves of every citizen. Rumors flew faster than telegraphs, whispering that German tanks had already breached the outer suburbs and that the Red Army had been annihilated. The confident propaganda broadcasts of the summer had been replaced by somber communiques that could no longer hide the terrifying truth: the enemy was at the gates. October 16th would go down in history as the Black Day of Moscow, a moment when the veneer of Soviet order shattered completely. For the first time in its history, the Moscow metro ceased operations, a shocking event that signaled to the populace that the end was imminent. The massive bronze doors of the stations were locked, and the trains were being prepared to be rigged with explosives to prevent them from falling into German hands. This shutdown was the spark that ignited the Great Panic. Thousands of workers arrived at their factories to find the gates open and the managers gone, having fled with the payroll in the night. The realization that the authorities were abandoning the ship sent a wave of hysteria through the population. The streets of the capital descended into chaos as the social contract evaporated within hours. Mobs began to loot grocery stores and supply depots, desperate to secure food for the uncertain future. Angry crowds intercepted cars carrying party officials and their families, dragging them out and accusing them of treason for trying to flee while the common people were left to die. The highway of enthusiasts, the main road leading east towards the Urals, became a clogged river of misery. Trucks, limousines, and horse-drawn carts were bumper to bumper, laden with furniture, suitcases, and terrified civilians. The police, usually a ubiquitous and feared presence, seemed to have vanished, leaving the city to the mercy of anarchy and fear. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was one of grim finality as the government prepared for the worst. The NKVD, the secret police, began a frantic effort to destroy anything of value to the Germans. In the courtyards of the Lubyanka and behind the Kremlin walls, huge bonfires were lit to burn classified files and intelligence dossiers. The smoke from these fires drifted over the city, carrying with it the charred remnants of state secrets, raining down like black snow on the heads of the fleeing refugees. Specialist demolition teams were dispatched to wire the city's most important landmarks, including the Bolshoi Theatre and the major bridges. With high explosives, Moscow was being prepared not just for capture, but for annihilation. At the center of this maelstrom stood Joseph Stalin, a man who held the fate of the nation in his hands. For several agonizing days, his resolve seemed to waver, His personal train stood waiting at the station, its engine running, ready to whisk him away to the safety of Kuybyshev, where a backup government had already been established. The Politburo urged him to leave, arguing that capture would mean the end of the Soviet state. Stalin paced the halls of his private dacha and the Kremlin corridors, chain-smoking his pipe, weighing the strategic value of survival against the symbolic power of presence. He knew that if he left, the morale of the army and the citizens would collapse entirely, and Moscow would fall without a fight. On October 19th, Stalin made the most critical decision of the entire war. He announced that he would stay in Moscow. The news electrified the city and instantly halted the panic. The realization that the Supreme Commander was still in the Kremlin, likely only a few miles from the front lines, stiffened the spines of the defenders. Stalin immediately declared a state of siege, imposing martial law with ruthless efficiency. The NKVD regiments reappeared on the streets with orders to shoot looters, spies, and panic mongers on sight. Checkpoints were established at every major intersection, and the chaotic flight to the east was forcibly stemmed. The city was no longer a refugee camp, it was being transformed into a fortress. The restoration of order was brutal but effective. Summary executions occurred in courtyards and street corners, sending a chilling message that the Soviet state was still very much in control. General Pavel Artemyev, the commander of the Moscow military district, organized destroyer battalions composed of fervent communists and Komsomol members to patrol the streets. They hunted for German saboteurs and signalers who were rumored to be guiding the Luftwaffe with flares. The terrifying discipline of the Stalinist system, which had been shaken during the panic, clamped back down with an iron grip. Fear of the Germans was replaced by the familiar fear of the state, and the population returned to work. With order restored, the entire population of Moscow was mobilized for the defense of the city. The visuals of the capital changed drastically. Beautiful boulevards were blocked by anti-tank hedgehogs, jagged crosses of welded steel beams that looked like giant caltrops. Sandbags were piled high against the windows of the ornate shops on Gorky Street. Barricades made of cobblestones, overturned trams, and felled trees were erected on every major approach. The gilded domes of the cathedrals were painted black to hide them from bombers, and the Kremlin walls were camouflaged with paint to look like rows of ordinary apartment buildings from the air. The city was donning armor, preparing for street-to-street fighting. The true heroes of this fortification effort were the women of Moscow. Over 250,000 civilians, the vast majority of them women and teenagers, were marched out to the suburbs to construct the defensive rings. In the freezing rain and sleet, without proper winter clothing or heavy machinery, they dug over 400 miles of anti-tank ditches. They worked until their hands bled and their backs gave out, hacking at the hardening earth with shovels and pickaxes. German planes frequently strafed these work parties, leaving lines of bodies in the mud. But the survivors simply filled the gaps and kept digging. They created an obstacle course that would force the panzers to bleed for every yard of ground. While the civilians dug, a miracle of industrial evacuation was taking place. The factories that could be moved were dismantled and shipped east, but those that remained were converted entirely to war production. The automobile plants began churning out submachine guns, and repair shops were transformed into tank depots. In some cases, T-34 tanks were driven straight off the assembly line, unpainted and lacking sights, directly to the front lines just a few miles away. The workers, many of them women and children replacing the men who had gone to the front, slept on the factory floors next to their machines, working 18-hour shifts to keep the Red Army supplied with ammunition. Despite the preparations, the Luftwaffe continued to pound the city. Night after night, the air raid sirens wailed, sending millions of Muscovites scurrying into the deep tunnels of the metro, which had been converted into massive bomb shelters. The stations became underground cities, complete with libraries, hospitals, and nurseries. On the surface, the anti-aircraft defenses put up a wall of flak so dense that few German bombers could penetrate to the city center. Roof watchers, often young girls, stood on the icy tin roofs with tongs, ready to grab incendiary bombs and toss them into buckets of sand before they could start fires. The city was battered and scarred, but it refused to burn. As the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution approached on November 7th, Stalin conceived of an audacious plan to demonstrate Soviet resolve. Traditionally, a massive military parade was held in Red Square on this date. His advisors were horrified, pointing out that the Germans were close enough to bomb the square and wipe out the entire Soviet leadership. Stalin overruled them. He ordered the parade to proceed in absolute secrecy. The troops were told they were gathering for a drill, and the Air Force was ordered to intercept any German aircraft that dared to approach the city on that morning. It was a gamble of immense proportions, a piece of theatre designed to show the world that Moscow still stood. On the morning of November 7th, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the city, grounding the German Air Force and providing the perfect cover. Thousands of troops, tanks, and cavalry units assembled in Red Square. Stalin stood atop Lenin's mausoleum, looking out at the rows of snow-covered soldiers. In his speech, he invoked the great Russian heroes of the past, Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Kutuzov, appealing to Russian nationalism rather than just communist ideology. He told the freezing soldiers that the war of liberation was a holy mission. The radio broadcast carried his voice across the world, shocking the Germans who believed he had long since fled. The parade was a surreal and emotional spectacle. The soldiers marching past the reviewing stand were not ceremonial troops in dress uniforms. They were combat units in heavy winter coats, carrying loaded weapons. As they passed the mausoleum and saluted, they did not turn back to the barracks. They marched straight from Red Square to the front lines, which were in some places only 15 miles away. The tanks that rumbled across the cobblestones carried full combat loads of ammunition. It was a defiant gesture that resonated deeply with the Russian people. The message was clear: there would be no surrender. Moscow would be defended to the last man. The Great Panic of October had been purged by the freezing winds of November and the iron will of the leadership. The city that had been on the verge of anarchy was now a united proparade, hardened fortress. The evacuation of the weak was over. Those who remained were ready to fight. As the snow continued to fall, burying the mud and the dead alike, the people of Moscow looked westward with a grim determination. They knew the German offensive was not over, that the final and most desperate assault was yet to come. But the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, deadly hatred. The stage was set for the Wehrmacht to throw itself against the immovable object that Moscow had become. November 15th brought a deceptive mercy to the Eastern Front, a meteorological shift that the German High Command had been praying for with desperate fervor. The temperature plummeted overnight, freezing the seemingly endless ocean of mud into a surface as hard as concrete. The Rasputitsa was over, and the roads, though deeply rutted and treacherous, were finally passable for the paralyzed armor. For the commanders in the warm headquarters of Army Group Center, this hard freeze was the signal to unleash the final act of Operation Typhoon. They believed the pause had been a mere intermission and that the Wehrmacht, revitalized by the solid ground, would now easily cover the remaining miles to the Kremlin and decapitate the Soviet regime before the end of the year. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, driven by an almost obsessive desire to capture the Soviet capital, issued orders that allowed for no retreat and no hesitation. He ignored the warnings from his quartermasters about the lack of winter clothing and the dangerously low fuel reserves. In his mind, and in the minds of many generals who had been seduced by the myth of their own invincibility, the Red Army was a hollow shell, held together only by fear and destined to shatter under one last heavy blow. The German plan was to envelop Moscow with a classic pincer movement, strangling the city from the north and south, effectively sealing it off from the rest of Russia and forcing a capitulation through starvation and bombardment. As the engines of thousands of tanks and half-tracks roared to life, coughing clouds of black diesel smoke into the freezing air, the German soldiers realized that the solid ground came with a terrible price. The cold was not merely a drop in temperature, it was an aggressive, predatory force. The thermometer continued to slide downward, reaching levels that European thermometers were not even calibrated to register. By late November, temperatures were consistently hovering around 20 to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The German army, still clad in the denim combat uniforms and jackboots designed for a summer campaign in France, found themselves marching into a white hell that stripped the heat from their bodies within minutes of exposure. At the Dubosekovo railway junction, a critical choke point south of the city. The renewed German offensive collided with the iron resolve of General Ivan Panfilov's 316th Rifle Division. This unit, composed largely of tough conscripts from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, had been ordered to hold their ground against the elite armour of the German 11th Panzer Division. On November 16th, a small group of 28 soldiers from this division fought a legendary engagement that would become the spiritual bedrock of the Soviet defence. Armed only with anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, and grenades, they dug into the frozen earth and prepared to face dozens of enemy tanks rolling towards their shallow trenches. The battle at the junction was a brutal, close-quarters nightmare where the technological superiority of the Germans was negated by the suicidal bravery of the defenders. The Soviet soldiers, realizing their anti-tank bullets were bouncing off the frontal armor of the panzers, waited until the steel monsters were almost on top of them before leaping out to throw incendiary bottles at the engine decks. Political instructor Vasily Klochkov rallied his men with words that would echo through history, reminding them that while Russia was vast, there was nowhere to retreat because Moscow was behind them. They managed to destroy over a dozen tanks, effectively blunting the spearhead in that sector, proving that the road to the capital would be paved with German wrecks. While the infantry bled in the snow, the German machinery began to fail in catastrophic and unforeseen ways. The intricate engineering that was the pride of the Wehrmacht proved to be its Achilles heel in the extreme cold. The lubricating oil in the tank engines and artillery pieces turned into a thick, glue-like gel, seizing up moving parts and rendering weapons useless. To start the tank engines in the morning, crews had to light fires under the hulls, a dangerous practice that often resulted in the vehicle burning down before it even saw combat. Optical sights frosted over on the inside, leaving gunners blind, and the recoil mechanisms of the heavy guns froze solid, turning artillery pieces into useless metal sculptures. The suffering of the individual German soldier reached levels of misery that defied description. Without winter coats, they stuffed newspapers, straw, and looted curtains into their uniforms in a pathetic attempt to create insulation. Frostbite became an epidemic that claimed more casualties than Soviet bullets. Men lost fingers, toes, and ears to the biting wind, their skin turning black and gangrenous. The standard-issue hobnailed jackboots conducted the cold directly from the snow to the feet, causing terrible injuries. Sentries were found frozen to death at their posts, rigid statues with rifles frozen to their hands, their eyes open and staring blankly into the white wasteland. Despite these horrific conditions, the sheer momentum of the German assault continued to drive the front line closer to Moscow. General Erich Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group, operating north of the city, managed to smash through the lines near Klin and Solnechnogorsk. They were advancing, but it was the advance of a dying organism, a zombie army moving forward on muscle memory alone. The Soviet defenders, now commanded by General Rokossovsky in this sector, practiced a ruthless strategy of elastic defense. They would hold a village until the last possible moment, inflicting maximum casualties, and then slip away into the forests on skis, leaving the Germans to inherit nothing but burning ruins and booby traps. To slow the German advance near Istra, the Soviet engineers deployed a weapon of mass destruction that utilized the landscape itself. They blew the sluice gates of the Istra reservoir, releasing a torrential wall of water that surged through the river valley. In the sub-zero temperatures, this flood did not just drown the lowlands, it created a rapidly freezing barrier of jagged ice and slush that was impassable to tanks. The German engineers, already exhausted and freezing, were forced to bridge a span that had suddenly tripled in width, all while under withering fire from the opposite bank. It was a delay of only a few days, but in the calculus of the battle, days were a currency the Germans could no longer afford. By the end of November, the German spearheads had reached the town of Krasnaya Polyana, a mere 18 miles from the Kremlin. The lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division captured the town after a fierce firefight, establishing the closest point the Wehrmacht would ever get to Moscow. From the bell tower of the local church, German artillery officers peered through their high-powered binoculars and saw a sight that made their hearts race. Through the breaks in the smoke and snow, they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin cathedrals glinting in the pale winter sun. They were so close they could practically calculate the firing coordinates for their heavy guns to shell Stalin's residence. However, this visual confirmation of the objective was a cruel taunt rather than a triumph. The German units at Krasnaya Polyana were utterly spent. They had outrun their supply lines by hundreds of miles. Their tanks were running on the last dregs of fuel, and their ammunition limbers were empty. The soldiers were effectively starving, surviving on frozen horse meat, hacked from the carcasses of their transport animals with bayonets. The dysentery that had plagued them in the mud was now killing them in the cold, as men were too weak to seek shelter. The officers looked at the spires of Moscow not with the hunger of conquerors, but with the desperation of men who knew they had reached the end of their tether. South of the city, General Guderian's forces were also hitting a wall of resistance that they could not breach. Trying to encircle the city from the Tula direction, Guderian found his tanks isolated and exposed on the open steppe. The Soviet T-34 seconds, painted in whitewash camouflage, were invisible against the snowdrifts until they opened fire. They struck the flanks of the German columns, cutting off supply trucks and isolating forward units. Guderian, who had practically invented the Blitzkrieg, was forced to admit in his diary that the offensive had failed. He wrote that the cold, the terrain, and the unexpected tenacity of the Russian soldier had made further maneuvering impossible. The German High Command, sitting in their heated bunkers in East Prussia, refused to accept the reality of the situation. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch urged the commanders to mobilize all spiritual reserves for one final push. But spiritual reserves could not replace gasoline or artillery shells. The disconnect between the map tables in Berlin and the frozen hell of the front lines was absolute. While Hitler demanded the capture of the city, battalion commanders were reporting that their companies were down to 20 effective men, commanded by sergeants because all the officers were dead or wounded. The command structure was fraying under the strain of impossible orders. As December arrived, the temperature dropped even further, hitting nearly 40 degrees below zero. The German army simply stopped moving. It was not a tactical halt, it was a physical impossibility to continue. The grease in the weapons had solidified. The engines were frozen blocks of iron, and the men were too apathetic from hypothermia to lift their rifles. They huddled in the cellars of captured villages, burning furniture to stay alive, listening to the wind howl outside. They had conquered all of Europe. But here, in the shadow of Moscow, the Wehrmacht had been defeated by the physics of the planet and the endurance of the Soviet people. The frozen gates of Moscow remained shut. The German army had lunged with everything it had. A desperate, flailing strike that had cost them the flower of their youth and the bulk of their equipment. They sat now in the snow, a frozen, jagged line stretching across the Russian plain, waiting for a victory that would never come. Unbeknownst to the shivering German sentries scanning the white horizon, the silence facing them was not one of defeat. Deep in the forests behind Moscow, the ground was beginning to tremble again, not with the arrival of German panzers, but with the gathering of a vengeance they could not even imagine. While the German army froze in the snowdrifts outside Moscow, a pivotal event was unfolding 4,000 miles away in the neon-lit shadows of Tokyo. Richard Sorge, a German journalist who was secretly the Soviet Union's most effective spy, transmitted a radio message that would alter the course of history. Through his high-level contacts within the Japanese government, Sorge had confirmed a vital piece of intelligence. Imperial Japan had decided to strike south against the United States and the British colonies, rather than north into Siberia. This transmission meant that the Soviet Union's vast eastern border, previously guarded against a potential Japanese invasion, was safe. The nightmare of a two-front war had evaporated, unlocking a strategic reserve that Hitler and his generals were convinced did not exist. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin held Sorge's cable in his hands, weighing the survival of his capital against the risk of leaving the Pacific coast defenseless. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, requiring a level of trust in intelligence that the paranoid dictator rarely exhibited. With the Germans clawing at the gates of Moscow, Stalin made his move. He issued the order to strip the Soviet Far East of its best divisions. These were not the terrified militia conscripts or the battered remnants of the Western armies. These were fresh, full-strength units that had been training for years in the harsh climate of the Amur and Ussuri regions. They were professional soldiers, and they were coming to save Moscow, The logistics of this transfer were a miracle of organization and secrecy, executed on the single steel artery of the Trans-Siberian Railway, day and night. The tracks hummed with the weight of thousands of flat cars carrying tanks, artillery, and men. The trains ran under strict blackout conditions, ghosting through the vast Siberian taiga and the Ural Mountains without stopping. To maximize speed, the dispatchers cleared the lines of all civilian traffic, creating a unidirectional flow of war material heading west. The sheer scale of the movement was massive, involving over 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft, all moving across a continent while the enemy remained blissfully unaware. On the German side, the intelligence failure was absolute and catastrophic. Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the German Foreign Army's East Intelligence, had assured the High Command that the Red Army was functionally dead. His reports confidently stated that Stalin had no reserves left, and that any new units appearing on the front were merely scraped together from the local population. The German aerial reconnaissance was grounded by the bad weather, blinding them to the massive build-up occurring just behind the Soviet lines. The Wehrmacht believed they were fighting the last survivors of a broken nation, never suspecting that a fresh army, larger than the one they had invaded with, was assembling in the forests a few miles away. The arrival of the Siberian divisions injected a new, terrifying variable into the equation of the battle. These men stepped off the trains dressed not in thin cotton tunics, but in heavy, quilted Telegraika jackets and trousers. On their heads, they wore thick fur Ushanka caps with ear flaps, and most importantly, on their feet were Valenki thick felt boots that were impervious to the cold. Unlike the freezing Germans, whose boots conducted the frost and led to gangrene, the Siberians could lie in the snow for hours without suffering. They were acclimatized to temperatures that froze the fluid in German eyeballs, moving through the winter landscape with the ease of apex predators in their natural element. Among these fresh troops were the dreaded ski battalions, specialized units that would haunt the German nightmares. Dressed in white camouflage smocks that made them invisible against the snow, these soldiers moved with silent, fluid speed through the dense forests where tanks and trucks could not go. They bypassed the German strongpoints, slipping through the gaps in the overstretched lines to strike at command posts and supply dumps in the rear. To the exhausted German sentries, they appeared like ghosts, materializing out of the blizzard to slash throats and vanish before a shot could be fired. They eroded the psychological security of the invaders, proving that the winter was not a neutral force, but a weapon belonging to Russia. Georgy Zhukov, now coordinating the defense and the upcoming counterstroke, played a high-stakes game of patience with these new forces. As the Germans pushed closer to Moscow in mid-November, the pressure to commit the Siberians piecemeal to plug the gaps was immense. Local commanders screamed for reinforcements as their lines buckled. But Zhukov refused. He knew that feeding the reserves into the grinder one battalion at a time would waste their potential. He hoarded his strength, hiding the new armies, the 1st Shock Army, the 10th Army, and the 20th Army deep in the rear, waiting for the precise moment when the German elastic finally snapped. It was a ruthless calculus that traded land and lives for the opportunity to deliver a knockout blow. The Soviet deception plan, or maskirovka, was enforced with draconian discipline to ensure total surprise. Radio silence was absolute. No commands were transmitted over the airwaves that German listening posts could intercept. Orders were delivered by couriers on horseback or motorcycles. Fake defensive positions were constructed to mislead German spotters, while the real concentrations of armor and artillery were camouflaged under nets and pine boughs in the dense woods. The tanks were painted white, and their tracks were covered to hide the telltale churned earth. The Soviets were building a coiled spring of immense power, and the Germans, blinded by their own arrogance and the blizzard, saw only a defeated enemy on the verge of collapse. Technologically, the Siberian units brought equipment that functioned where German engineering failed. The Soviet weapons were built with loose tolerances that allowed them to operate despite the thermal contraction of the metal. The oil used in their guns and engines was formulated for Arctic conditions, remaining fluid when German lubricants turned to paste. The T-34 seconds were equipped with compressed air systems to start their diesel engines in the sub-zero cold, whereas the Germans had to light dangerous fires under their panzers to thaw the engine blocks. This mechanical reliability meant that when the order to attack came, the Soviet machine would roar to life instantly, while the Wehrmacht would be struggling to even get their weapons to fire. By the first days of December, the German offensive had culminated. Stalling just miles from the city centre, they were a spent force, strung out along a thin, freezing line, lacking fuel, ammunition, and hope. They assumed the lull in the fighting was mutual. Believing the Russians were just as exhausted and frozen as they were, they dug in, expecting to hibernate in their miserable holes until spring. They did not hear the distant rumble of thousands of tank engines warming up in the east. They did not see the tens of thousands of white-clad infantrymen moving into their jump-off positions under the cover of the long winter night. The atmosphere in the Soviet staging areas was electric with vengeance. The soldiers were well-fed, warm, and highly motivated. They had seen the devastation the Germans had wrought on their country, and they were eager to turn the tide. Political commissars moved among the men, reading speeches not about abstract communism, but about the defense of the motherland and the protection of their families. They were told that the fascists were weak, freezing, and ripe for destruction. The fear that had paralyzed the Red Army in the summer was gone, replaced by a cold, professional determination to exterminate the invader. On the night of December 4th, the temperature dropped to -30 degrees, a crushing cold that cracked trees and froze breath instantly. Under this cover of extreme weather, the final pieces of Zhukov's trap clicked into place. The artillery plotters calculated their firing solutions on the German positions that had remained static for days. The cavalry corps, mounted on hardy steppe ponies that could traverse the deep snow, sharpened their sabers. The pilots of the Red Air Force warmed their engines, prepared to seize air superiority from the grounded Luftwaffe. The hidden reserves were no longer a secret to be guarded. They were an avalanche waiting for the signal to fall. As the dawn of December 5th approached, a strange silence hung over the front line. The German sentries stamped their feet and tried to stay awake, peering into the grey mist, unaware that they were staring into the muzzle of a loaded gun. The myth of German invincibility was about to be dismantled, not by mud or luck, but by superior strategy and the fresh strength of the Siberian divisions. The breath of the East had arrived, and it was about to blow the Wehrmacht away from the gates of Moscow forever. The wait was over. The order was given. At 3 o'clock in the morning on December 5th, 1941, the frozen silence of the Kalinin front was shattered by a sound that signaled the end of the German dream. Thousands of Soviet artillery pieces, concealed for weeks in the deep pine forests, opened fire simultaneously in a barrage that turned the night sky into a flickering sheet of lightning. The ground shook violently as high-explosive shells slammed into the German forward positions, obliterating dugouts and burying sleeping soldiers alive in their foxholes. This was not merely a harassment bombardment, it was a drumfire of annihilation, a calculated release of the massive stockpile of ammunition that Zhukov had hoarded while the enemy exhausted themselves at the gates. As the artillery fire lifted, the snow-covered fields north and south of Moscow came alive with a terrifying new threat. The engines of the T-34 and KV-1 tanks roared to life, and the white-clad Siberian infantry rose from the earth like avenging spirits. They charged across the frozen ground, riding on the backs of the tanks or skiing swiftly on the flanks, closing the distance before the stunned German sentries could raise the alarm. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was on the receiving end of a coordinated, combined arms offensive executed with overwhelming force. The German lines, brittle and overextended, shattered almost instantly under the weight of the hammer blow. Inside the German foxholes, panic and confusion reigned supreme as the defenders tried frantically to respond to the onslaught. Soldiers scrambled to man their machine guns, only to find the actions frozen solid, the firing pins snapping uselessly against the cold steel. Anti-tank gunners tried to traverse their weapons, but the grease in the gears had turned to stone, leaving them helpless as the Soviet tanks rolled over their positions. The terrifying realization washed over the German troops that they were defenseless. Their technology had failed them. Their leaders had lied to them about the enemy's strength, and now they were being overrun by an army that was supposed to be dead. The reports reaching the headquarters of Army Group Center were chaotic and incredulous. painting a picture of total collapse across the entire front. Field Marshal von Bock and General Guderian stared at their maps in disbelief as red arrows began to pierce deep into their rear areas. They had convinced themselves that the Russians were incapable of a major offensive, yet here were reports of entire divisions being encircled and destroyed. The intelligence failure was total. The ghost divisions from Siberia were not only real, but they were also tearing the heart out of the German army. The hunters had become the hunted, and the realization paralyzed the German command structure. By December 6th, the offensive had broadened to include the western and southwestern fronts, creating a massive arc of fire stretching for hundreds of miles. The Soviet objective was to chop up the German panzer groups and destroy them in detail. The same pincer tactics that the Germans had used so effectively in the summer were now being turned against them. Mobile groups of Soviet cavalry and ski troops slipped through the gaps in the line, severing communication wires and ambushing supply columns miles behind the front. The German units, isolated and blind, began to abandon their positions without orders, driven by the primal instinct to escape the closing trap. The retreat, when it began, was not a tactical withdrawal, but a disorganized flight that quickly descended into a rout. The roads leading west, which had been clogged with advancing German armor just days before, now became scenes of apocalyptic destruction. German drivers, desperate to escape the advancing T-34 seconds, floored their accelerators. But the icy roads were unforgiving. Trucks slid into ditches and were abandoned. Half-tracks ran out of fuel and were left as burning roadblocks. The pride of the Wehrmacht, its heavy equipment, was jettisoned by the ton. Artillery pieces were spiked and left behind because the horses were dead and the prime movers would not start in the cold. General Guderian, seeing his Second Panzer Army threatened with total annihilation near Tula, made the fateful decision to retreat against Hitler's express wishes. He recognized that his choice was stark withdrawal to a defensible line or lose his entire army in a snowy cauldron. As his tanks reversed course, they left a trail of wreckage that marked the end of the Blitzkrieg. The invincibility of the German armor was broken not just by the enemy, but by the environment. The sight of the elite panzer divisions fleeing in disarray sent a shockwave through the ranks, shattering the morale that had sustained them through the long march from the border. The liberation of the first towns, such as Klin and Solnechnogorsk, provided the Soviet troops with a grim motivation that fueled their advance. As the Red Army entered these settlements, they were greeted by weeping civilians emerging from cellars, telling horrific stories of occupation and starvation. The soldiers saw the gallows in the town squares and the frozen bodies of partisans left as warnings. This visual evidence of the enemy's brutality stripped away any mercy the Soviet soldiers might have felt. The counteroffensive became a crusade of vengeance. In many sectors, few prisoners were taken, the rage of the liberators was too great, and the logistical burden of captives too high in the freezing wastes. Overhead, the Red Air Force seized control of the skies, compounding the misery of the retreating Germans. The Luftwaffe, grounded by the freezing temperatures and a lack of heated hangars, could do little to protect their fleeing columns. Soviet Stormoviks and P-2 bombers roared low over the white landscape, strafing the clogged roads with impunity. The black lines of German vehicles against the white snow made perfect targets. The roads became ribbons of fire and death, forcing the German infantry to abandon the roads and trudge through the waist-deep snow of the forests, where they fell victim to the frost and the waiting partisans. The imagery of the retreat began to resemble the disastrous withdrawal of Napoleon's Grande Armée from Moscow in 1812, a historical parallel that haunted the German officers. The once proud soldiers of the Wehrmacht were reduced to a ragtag mob, wrapped in stolen women's fur coats, shawls, and blankets to ward off the biting wind. Their discipline eroded with every mile of the retreat. Officers lost control of their men, who discarded their rifles to lighten their loads. The master race was stumbling westward, bowing their heads against the blizzard, defeated by the resilience of the Slavic people they had sought to enslave. In Berlin, the mood shifted from arrogance to panic as the scale of the disaster became undeniable. Adolf Hitler, pacing in the wolf's lair, refused to accept the reality of the situation, railing against his generals for their cowardice. He could not comprehend that his will alone was insufficient to stop the Soviet tanks. On December 8th, he issued his infamous Directive 39, ordering the army to switch to a defensive posture. But it was too late. The momentum had shifted irrevocably. The German army was not just stopping, it was being pushed back by a tidal wave that threatened to engulf the entire Army Group center. By the middle of December, the immediate threat to Moscow had been eliminated. The front line had been pushed back over 100 kilometers in some sectors, and the Kremlin was no longer within range of German artillery. The capital, which had held its breath for 2 months, finally exhaled. The victory was celebrated not with parades, for the war was far from over, but with a grim satisfaction. The Red Army had done the impossible. They had taken the full force of the German war machine, stopped it cold, and thrown it back into the snow. The Battle of Moscow was won, and the myth of German invincibility lay shattered on the frozen fields. The chaotic retreat of the Wehrmacht from the gates of Moscow threatened to devolve into a catastrophic repetition of Napoleon's disaster of 1812. A historical spectre that terrified the German High Command more than the Soviet tanks. By mid-December, the German lines were dissolving, with units fleeing westward in a disorganized mob, abandoning heavy equipment and wounded comrades to the mercy of the snow. The road back to Smolensk was lined with the frozen carcasses of the once invincible army, a grim tableau of defeat that signaled the total collapse of morale. It appeared that Army Group Center was on the verge of total disintegration. A collapse that would have left the road to Berlin wide open for the vengeful Red Army. In this moment of supreme crisis, Adolf Hitler intervened with a ruthlessness that would fundamentally alter the nature of the German command structure for the remainder of the war. On December 19th, he dismissed Field Marshal von Brauchitsch and personally assumed command of the German army, appointing himself as the supreme operational commander. Ignoring the pleas of his generals who advocated for a tactical withdrawal to shorten the lines, Hitler issued his infamous Stand Fast order, or Haltebefehl. He commanded that every soldier must dig in exactly where they stood, regardless of the terrain or the enemy pressure, and hold their positions to the last round and the last man. The order was a death sentence for thousands of men, but it undeniably prevented the total dissolution of the front. Hitler demanded that the troops create hedgehogs, fortified strongpoints, centered around villages and supply depots, where they would fight in all directions, even if surrounded. This strategy forced the freezing soldiers to defend indefensible ruins in the middle of the Russian winter, stripped of their mobility and their hope of a warm billet in the rear. The German infantry, lacking winter clothing and heavy weapons, used blocks of ice to build parapets and watered them down to freeze them into rock-hard barriers, creating fortresses out of the frozen wasteland itself. The cost of this stabilization was astronomical, paid for in the currency of frostbite and gangrene rather than just bullet wounds. The medical services of the Wehrmacht were overwhelmed by a deluge of casualties caused solely by the cold. Tens of thousands of soldiers underwent amputations in field hospitals that lacked anesthesia, soaring through bone while the sounds of the blizzard drowned out the screams. The White Hell of Russia claimed more combat effectiveness than the Soviet artillery, stripping the German army of its veteran corps. The experienced non-commissioned officers, the men who had led the victories in Poland and France, were dying in the snow, replaced by raw recruits who had never known victory. Simultaneously, a purge of historic proportions swept through the upper echelons of the German military leadership. Hitler, looking for scapegoats to blame for the failure of Operation Typhoon, fired the architects of the Blitzkrieg. Field Marshal von Bock was relieved of command of Army Group Center. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Arm, was dismissed for ordering a retreat against orders, and General Erich Hoepner was stripped of his rank and dishonorably discharged. The Professional Officer Corps, which had operated with a degree of autonomy and tactical brilliance, was decapitated. From this point on, the German army was led by sycophants who feared the Führer more than the enemy, paralyzing their ability to react to the fluid reality of the battlefield. The material losses suffered outside Moscow were equally devastating, crippling the Wehrmacht's offensive capabilities for nearly a year. In the span of a few weeks, the Germans lost over 100,000 trucks and vehicles, rendering their motorized divisions effectively foot mobile. Thousands of artillery pieces and tanks were abandoned because they could not be started or moved, granting the Soviets a treasure trove of salvageable equipment. The industrial might of Germany, already strained by the blockade, could not replace these losses quickly enough. The Blitzkrieg, a doctrine reliant on speed, concentration of force, and mechanized superiority, died in the snowdrifts of Moscow, replaced by a grinding war of attrition that Germany was ill-equipped to sustain. Strategically, the failure to take Moscow marked the failure of Plan Barbarossa and the end of Germany's hope for a short war. The premise of the invasion had been to knock the Soviet Union out of the war in a single campaign, securing the resources of the East before the Western Allies could intervene. Now, Germany faced exactly what it had dreaded most, a prolonged, two-front war against a coalition of the world's greatest industrial powers. Just days after the Soviet counteroffensive began, Hitler declared war on the United States, sealing the fate of the Reich in a global conflict where the mathematics of production and manpower were hopelessly against him. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Moscow was the salvation of the nation, a miraculous reprieve that prevented the total collapse of the state. It proved to the world, and more importantly to the Soviet people, that the German army could be beaten. The psychological impact was profound. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Wehrmacht since 1939 was shattered. The images of German prisoners of war, shivering and broken, marching through the streets of Moscow, replaced the fear of the master race with a burning contempt. The Red Army had paid a horrific price, suffering nearly as many casualties in the victory as the Germans did in defeat, but they had survived the initial onslaught. However, the euphoria of the victory led Joseph Stalin to make the same mistake of overconfidence that had doomed the Germans. Believing the Wehrmacht was on the verge of total collapse, he ordered a general offensive across the entire front in early 1942, attempting to drive the Germans all the way back to the border. This ambition exceeded the capabilities of the exhausted Red Army. The German hedgehogs held, and the Soviet offensive eventually stalled in the bloody meat grinder of Rzhev. The war would drag on for 3.5 more years of unimaginable brutality, but the initiative had shifted. The Germans would launch other offensives, but never again would they possess the overwhelming strategic dominance they held in the autumn of 1941. The aftermath of the battle also revealed the true, genocidal nature of the war in the East to the Soviet soldiers. As they liberated the towns and villages west of Moscow, they discovered the atrocities left behind by the retreating invaders. They found mass graves of civilians, burnt-out hospitals with patients still inside, and villages where every living thing had been exterminated. These discoveries hardened the hearts of the Soviet soldiers, fueling a hatred that would carry them all the way to Berlin. The war was no longer just a defense of territory. It was a war of extermination, where surrender was not an option and mercy was a forgotten concept. Back in Germany, the failure at Moscow sent shockwaves through the civilian population, piercing the veil of propaganda that Joseph Goebbels had carefully constructed. The sudden call for the collection of warm clothing, ski jackets, fur coats, and woolen blankets from the German public in late December was a tacit admission that the war was not going according to plan. The rumors from the soldiers returning on leave, whispering of the cold and the endless waves of Russian tanks, began to erode the home front's morale. The German people realized that the final victory promised by Hitler was a lie, and that a long, dark shadow was falling over the Reich. The Battle of Moscow remains the largest single battle in human history in terms of the number of combatants involved, surpassing even Stalingrad and Kursk. Over 7 million soldiers fought on the fields around the Soviet capital, and nearly 2.5 million of them became casualties. It was a clash of titans where the landscape itself became a weapon. The snow that covered the dead in the winter of 1941 hid the scars of the land. But when the spring thaw finally arrived in 1942, it revealed a countryside churned into a graveyard of metal and bone. The rusting hulks of panzers and the bleaching bones of the fallen remained for decades, silent monuments to the turning point of the war. Ultimately, the Battle of Moscow was the moment where the timeline of the 20th century bent away from a Nazi victory. If Moscow had fallen, the Soviet transportation network would have been severed, the political will might have collapsed, and the vast resources of Eurasia would have been at Hitler's disposal. By holding the line, the defenders of Moscow bought the time necessary for the Allies to mobilize their industrial might. It was the first nail in the coffin of the Third Reich.